there is the imagery is extraordinarily ornate, I would say. And I was noticing in poem after poem a sort of attraction to couplets and tercets. And I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about form. I was wondering if that was a way of thinking about how to manage something that was extremely rich in its allusions and its elusiveness, but then also its imagery. So can you talk about the couplets and tercets and how you were thinking formally about the collection?
Sure. So in a sense, I was thinking of each poem as its own kind of jewel, in a sense. So I wrote these poems with kind of like a loose sonnet form in the background. And I didn't do it intentionally at first, but then as I started working on the poems, I could kind of see that form emerging. And so I started then, like halfway through, really trying to impose that as like a loose border to push up against. Otherwise, the idea of writing a myth, or rewriting a myth, you could go on and on and on, right? And as Emily Wilson has done an amazing job with her translation of the Odyssey, where she does line by line. So the lines, there aren't more lines in her translation than in what she's translating. But for me, I wanted to use some constraints, and one was ornate language. I really wanted to heighten the imagery and the syntax and make it slightly less conversational and more strange and more ornate, maybe more ancient. Because I felt like if I'm going to use these old ancient stories that were told in maybe Urdu, Sanskrit, all these old ancient languages, when I translate them, I'm not doing a real translation because I can't read Sanskrit, but I want to translate some of that same ornateness into the language. And then similarly, like the couplets, I've always loved a couplet. You show me a good couplet, I love it. And I like the tightness of it. I like the unit that it gives a poem. And it doesn't work for every type of material, but I felt like for this kind of material, I could work within those two constraints to kind of create like a room, right? To create a room that was very ornate or jewel-like.
I would like you to talk about how you see the difference between translation and reimagination happening, because it sounds like you are thinking about these poems as a kind of act of translation, not just reimagination. So what do you see as the difference between them, and what is the similarity?
Well, I am so envious of people who can do translation because I can't read Hindi. I'm kind of illiterate. I mean, I can understand it and I can speak it with a terrible, terrible accent. But I think the art of translation is really coming into its own now. I think a lot of poets are working in translation. For me, I felt like what I was doing was I was reading a translation and then trying to kind of reimagine that translation. So for this project in particular, I read a lot of different versions of these myths from a lot of different points of view. And then from all of those, I kind of came up with my reimagining. Which I think is slightly different than working deeply within, say, translating one text or one poet. I feel like that is like a different relationship where you really get to live in that world. And for me, I was just kind of reading a lot and kind of creating some semblance of a world that was kind of aligned with what I was reading.
But there's also the nation you've created is very contemporary. And when we're thinking about what we translate, oftentimes we're thinking about what we can't export from one language to the next. And oftentimes that's based on who we think we're speaking to, who is the audience that we're speaking, like what kinds of poetic devices, what kinds of nuances in the language are they going to want to hear that brings, even as it doesn't duplicate the original, does something. And so I find it interesting you chose sonnets, right? Because of course, an English reading audience is immediately going to be thinking, okay, it's a rhetorical structure. Okay, it's got something to do with the love poem tradition. It's got something to do with thinking through an issue. But again, what you choose to export, what you choose not to export, I think is quite interesting with regard to the images of the women themselves, the ways in which we imagine them. Because I have to say, like, I think that this is very much choosing not to translate certain beliefs about these women. And so I feel like I'm going back a bit to one of my earlier questions, like, what things did you choose not to translate, I guess, around these archetypes of these women?
I mean, I think what I tried to do was, in particular, was assume that there was some base knowledge, even though there wasn't. So it was like this tightrope of what do people know just generally about these goddesses, and that I could kind of gloss over, the marriage and the exile into the forest the first time, and then the exile later, and then she gives birth to twins and all of that. Like I didn't want to get bogged down in the narrative of that.
Right.
But there was a tightrope because, again, when we're writing, we're just writing. But then in the revision of it, or the new vision of it, I take into consideration audience as well, right? So it was, who is my reading audience and how much would they know? And how much is it okay that they just don't know? So I kind of glossed over a lot of the standard narratives of these goddesses, because for me, what was more important was the stories behind them, the emotions, because again, I was kind of focusing on tone. So the idea of love does get love get reincarnated. So I have a lot of poems in here that kind of grapple with the idea of what happens when two people fall in love and then they reincarnate, which is what happens with these gods and goddesses over and over again. I thought that idea was really, really interesting. So I kind of focus more on those aspects of love, of betrayal, all the good, juicy drama stuff. But the other kind of components of their stories, I figured either people knew, or if they didn't know, the approach of the poems themselves are such that a contemporary reader who's unfamiliar with them could just pick up the book and just read them as kind of love poems, betrayal poems, that sort of thing.
I like that. I'm going to to that question because I think that has a real bite to it when we're thinking about being Asian American as an author and the publishing world. So I'll talk about that. I'm going to put a pin in that. But one of the things that struck me so much about this collection, and it said something about what I think mistakenly understood about reincarnation, is that the idea is you come back and I get another shot, potentially to perfect yourself. Eventually you'll hopefully leave the wheel of samsara, but in fact, you're always kind of struggling through it. And one of the things that comes up in a couple of the poems is a refrain line, which is that in the next, this is what we lost in this other incantation, iteration. There was another line, which is, I think it's a line, oh gosh, I can't even figure out where it is, but there's this wonderful line, which is sort of like, I'm less of myself. I become less with you every single time. And that really surprised me, that I was thinking of reincarnation as largely a positive thing. But in this book, to a certain extent, reincarnation doesn't represent an increase or a progressive expansion of self. It represents decreation. Is that a fair assessment, or do you think that that gets challenged too?
Absolutely, because I mean, I'm not really a practicing Hindu, but I grew up in a household where we did believe in certain things. And so this idea of reincarnation, really, it's hard for me to grapple with. I like the idea of the next time to get better at or fulfill something that the last life didn't. But then when I was thinking again about like, well, what happens when you're in like a relationship that you really love or treasure, what happens to that? Or if you're a goddess already in one life, when you get reincarnated, I mean, you were already a goddess. So like, what's going to happen? Like, are you going to lose, all the wonderful parts about being a goddess, right? So I kind of wanted to, again, change the angle of what most people know about reincarnation, because I really wanted to focus on the idea of what do you lose every time, every time if you're repeating. And some of these gods and goddesses, of course, they get reincarnated and they, of course, in the next life meet up again. So it's also this idea of like, are you recycling some of the not great behaviors of a previous relationship, which again, I thought would be sort of interesting for a contemporary audience to kind of think about.
Anyone who's in their 20s has essentially gone through this, but also, it speaks again to the idea of why would we go back to some of these ancient stories, which is that in some ways all of us are reincarnations. Unfortunately, socially, we're constructed to reincarnate these tropes, these archetypes, in the hopes that maybe we change them, or maybe we get, but the book also makes this, I think that's what fascinates me about how the book is constructed with these creation, destruction myths, and we end up with Dharma, but then the last line of Dharma is start again. So it invites you to go back to the book. And so we end up reimagining, reliving this kind of relationships that these female speakers are living in real time in front of us. And as they don't progress, neither in some sense does the reader. I want to get to, sort of for our last few minutes together, get to that very sticky question about, as an Asian American woman author, we're trying to talk about that, where what you are going to assume or hope that an audience knows, and how you're going to write to construct a world that is both inviting but not pandering, right? I mean, you are publishing in an English language context, in an environment that is still very white dominated. So I'm kind of wondering if you could talk a little bit more about thinking about how you approached that, what you were worried about, or what you do worry about with how people are going to approach the collection.
Yeah, so, when I first started writing, and I think that's true for almost every writer, I don't know of any writer who just like sits down and is like thinking about the audience when they first sit down to write. It's usually whatever the inspiration is. And for me, it really was like reading these picture books to my son and thinking like, oh, all the goddesses are just like these plot devices, or these like, archetypal stereotypes, where they're like one-dimensional. And so that's really the challenge for me, was initially to imagine that other aspect of a story. But again, as I was rewriting and revisioning, I really have some great readers who are smart, who are not Asian American, but know this, like I know something about it, and I would the poems, and I just say, just tell me what you think. And they would help me kind of think about what images I'm using to communicate the ideas that are kind of these ancient ideas, But it's hard because I think that generally speaking, when I was growing up, Indian culture as a whole, South Asian culture as a whole, No matter what religion you were, nobody really knew much about it. And then only just now, I feel like in the last 30 years, some part of South Asian culture has sort of been a part of the fabric of American life a whole lot more visible, which is really great. So now you will have people who are like, oh, I know about that goddess, or I've heard about this. Whereas when I was growing up, really nobody I hung out with that wasn't South Asian would know any of these stories. So it is, like I said, that kind of balancing act that only comes in after the initial impulse of writing the book kind of made its way into my brain. But also, it's hard to separate because I've grown up in America. I'm basically American. So it's kind of holding those two things together. It's like I'm not a scholar, right? So I've read and I've taken a class here or there, but I'm not a deep scholar of this. And so the book is not meant for that. It's not meant to kind of really investigate myth in that way. It's more of a intimate, personal way into these stories. So yeah, I think like once I figured out like it's really about these two people and kind of a little bit of a dysfunctional relationship or a lot of a dysfunctional relationship. Once I really thought about that, like, oh, it's like two people and one person doesn't believe the other person. And no matter what this person does, nothing's good enough, and it's that idea. That's the other idea that's kind of going through the book, which is this idea of for women in particular, it's this idea of being good enough, right? Like you're never good enough. And so in this context, she's never good enough to be the goddess that people want her to be. But you can translate that into any number of different roles that we take on in life,
Yeah. And I want to focusing on that word intimate, which I thought was such a good way to describe the book, because when I was reading it, I was struck. Oftentimes I sort of don't pay that much attention to pronouns except for a sort of deictic, like where are we, who's speaking to whom. But it felt very private. It felt like overhearing two people talking, or especially one person imagining or speaking very directly to somebody else. So I feel like direct address is so important in this book in ways that I haven't seen in a lot of books for a while now. But our time is kind of coming to a close, and I really want to end with you reading another poem from the book so people can hear this wonderful voice and go out and buy it.
Yes. Okay. So this next poem is basically kind of stepping back away from a particular goddess and kind of more tackling what we were talking about, this idea of being good enough, just as a person, as a woman. And so this is called Because You Forgot Me, I Am Weird in the World. After all my wildness turned to white, only a little bit of me wanted to be saved. Already changed, wallflower, paper flower, I was hidden and pressed, my soul a thin slotted door, an opening in the brush. The forest crowds around me to stare, blank-eyed, free of conscience. Those eyes see what I've become, a bride burning like her own planet.
That is gorgeous. All right. So please rush out and buy Burning Like Her Own Planet, just released from Alice James' books. Thank you again, Van, for doing this. This has been so much fun. But that is all the time we have for today. So thank you again for coming in and talking about your book and reading those poems. And thank you all out there for tuning in. And again, if you like this program, you can follow me, Paisley Rekdal, High Country News' poetry editor, and High Country News for more such interviews in the coming months. There's going to be a ton. So if you want to ensure that High Country News and these types of programs continue, please consider subscribing. High Country News is a nonprofit, reader-supported publication. It's been covering the West for more than 50 years. We can't create things like this without readers and listeners like you. So please go to our website at hdn.org to subscribe or donate. And you can follow us on all of the socials at High Country News. You can follow me on Twitter and Facebook at Paisley Rekdal. And Van has a website. Just what is that website, real quickly?
It's literally vankhanna.com.
There you go. And please go out and buy this book. Thank you guys all so much. And I will see you, Van, somewhere out in the world, hopefully soon.
Thank you so much, Paisley. This was lovely.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye.